Okay. Today's event is jointly sponsored by Radical Women and the Freedom Socialist Party. And just so you know who I am, I'm Chris Smith, the chair of the program, and I go by he, him, his. I came out in 1973 and have never looked back. With the help of the Freedom Socialist Party and my sisters in Radical Women, we have agitated to win LGBTQ rights, and our lives have gotten somewhat better. I was a founding member of the Freedom Day Committee that organized Pride marches from 1981 to 2000. And I learned one valuable lesson that I want to let you know about, because it's still relevant today. The Freedom Day Committee successfully built a coalition that brought together protest and celebration. It welded together many diverse groups like Dykes on Bikes, Seattle Men's Chorus, the Women's Coalition to Stop the Green River Murders, the Knights of Malta, a leather group, Steve Farmer Defense Committee, Radical Women, and the Freedom Socialist Party, all with very different, well, and tons of other groups, but all with very different ideas and tactics, but still able to come together to work towards one agreed on goal. And that's what made the committee so effective for the 20 years that we organized the Gay Pride marches. One example of how this worked was the FDC called a community meeting to discuss changing the name of the event. So we got everybody involved. The proposal was to add trans and bisexuals to the name. And after a big, long discussion with over 300 community members attending, it was then debated, voted on, and the two names were added. So that's just one example of how it works. It's building that united front action that's such an excellent way to bring about change. And I really think it can be used for today's fights. And wouldn't that be a great way to promote a better situation for trans youth and trans people? As I said, today's event is sponsored by the Freedom Socialist Party and Radical Women, and both of those groups have consistently embraced gender equality and the fight for the right for all of us to determine who we are. Today, I think transgender people are coming out. They're fighting hard to exist openly. They're pushing back against sexist and racist stereotypes. They're demanding respect, and they're stepping into the light in all their radiance. But the brave, self-affirming actions have exposed a dark cloud of reaction. Trans people are facing over 200 anti-trans bills introduced in state legislatures. 1 in 5 trans people of color has experienced homelessness. Trans people are 3.7 times more likely to suffer from police violence. And as we know, these attacks are most often aimed at trans youth, especially trans youth of color. In the Freedom Socialist newspaper, there's a great article by Charlotte Swanson from Colorado, who writes on attacks against transgender youth in the current issue. And it also features a really good editorial demanding Congress pass the Equality Act. So I'd encourage everyone to get a copy by going to socialism.com, where you can get an online subscription or a paper subscription for 10 bucks. And I think the link for the newspaper will be added to chat. Okay, on tonight's program, or this afternoon in Seattle, the agenda for the program features 3 speakers. Following the speakers will be discussion, where I'll take names and call on you. And after that, there will be an informal discussion. So please stick around online for more just getting to know each other, getting to know radical women, and getting to know the Freedom Socialist Party. Just a couple of rules or techniques with chat with Zoom. I suggest you view the event by clicking on speaker in the upper right corner where it says view. Click on speaker, and that will highlight well, actually the tech people, I've already highlighted the speakers. And the tech team has also muted everybody. So when it's your turn to speak, you'll have to unmute yourself if you can remember to do that. And we'd like to ask that we keep chat during the presentations to a minimum so that we really focus on the speakers and what they have to say. During discussion, of course, it's fine to put stuff into the chat. And now I'd like to welcome our speakers. We have Cassidy Boehm from New York, Sarah Scott from Seattle, and JESS STEEVER from Los Angeles. So our first speaker will be Cassidy Boehm, who goes by she, her, hers. Cassidy is a transgender activist, a student, a communist. She is on the steering committee of the Campaign for an Elected Civilian Review Board, and that's fighting to hold New York City cops accountable to the community. So Cassidy, you want to go ahead and start us off?
Yeah, great. Thanks for introducing me, Chris.
All right.
So I'll just get right into it then. So as I'm sure many of us are aware, over 100 bills have been introduced to state legislatures this year, designed to directly target trans people. And these bills have been mainly focused on two areas, both mainly focused on trans youth. So one is targeting trans youth access to healthcare, especially hormone replacement therapy. That's one specific medical intervention that's been targeted by a lot of this legislature and or legislation. And the other is students' rights to play on sports teams that correspond with their gender identity. So a lot of the sports legislation that comes out is specifically focused on public schools, allowing, or specifically not allowing, students to choose which sports team best suits their gender identity, and forcing them to, if they so choose to join a sports team, to play with their gender assigned at birth. So this has been called a record-breaking year for anti-trans legislation, and in many ways that's a fair description. This is a sort of particularly bad wave of attacks against trans people. But it's also important to remember that attacks like this don't just come from a vacuum. That there's a much broader context of the patriarchy, the prison industrial complex, and capitalism all sort of overlapping to push anti-trans policy that at this point our society is essentially founded on. So while we talk about and recognize and address this issue, I also want to keep in mind that this is just one small aspect of a much, much broader issue that we need to sort of keep in the back of our minds. So with that being said, why is this wave sort of coming at us now? And I think that there are a lot of reasons for that. One is actually, as Chris sort of touched on, that trans people over the past, really over the past several decades, but especially over the past couple of years, have been gaining much more visibility, especially trans people who don't necessarily fall onto the gender binary or don't necessarily accept the gender binary. That is something that has sort of exploded over the past couple of years, and is gaining a lot more visibility. So whenever there is sort of a big shift and a certain group becomes much more visible and starts sort of fighting for themselves much more, there's always sort of a reactionary pushback against that. In addition to that, the conservatives in the US are sort of view Biden and the Democrats as radicals waging sort of culture war against them. And in this culture war, one of the sort of primary weapons of the left, this is of course in the conservatives' view, is trans people. They view trans people as a threat to American and Western culture. And there are a few reasons that this is viewed that way. One is that trans people sort of by definition disrupt people's ideas about gender, or disrupt the sort of commonly held ideas about gender. We sort of defy gender rigidity and make gender identity about sort of internal and psycho-emotional factors, which are much more sort of personal and about one's feelings and who they are, as opposed to sort of easily observable external and tangible factors, such as like gender expression, gender assigned at birth, and probably most importantly, gender roles. So gender roles are put in place for a reason, that they are designed to advance economic development and productivity. So by redefining gender about something that is for us, that we take joy in, instead of something that is just essentially laundry list of duties, is very threatening. So that is sort of one of the reasons that the trans people or some of the reasons that trans people are viewed as a threat. And while we're not the only sort of target in this culture war, trans people are sort of low-hanging fruit for a lot of reasons. One of this is that most people on both sides don't actually know or understand very many trans people. So if trans people are just sort of a concept, as opposed to, for example, people of color, where the majority of people know someone who's a person of color, for example, or women, or many other minorities. Since trans people are such a small minority, I think that people can often think of it as not really understand it as personally. And in addition to that, we have sort of been skewed to be viewed as a threat towards women and children, which is now a very sort of ingrained belief about trans people in American culture. And this has been done to so many oppressed groups and marginalized groups throughout history. Most, or maybe not most notably, but notably towards people of color and Black people during the Civil Rights Movement, gay and queer people during the gay liberation movement, and now trans people, and obviously many more. This is sort of a go-to thing to say, oh no, we're not just trying to harm this group, we're actually trying to protect these sort of innocent, helpless victims, which are women and children. And finally, on a legal level, trans people have significantly less protection than most other minority groups. Because in Title IX, the title banning sex discrimination, it just bans discrimination based on sex. So that can be interpreted as banning transphobia, or it cannot. So, for example, if it would now be not allowed under Title IX to, for example, not allow cross-dressing, because that's punishing a man for dressing like a woman or vice versa. But if you just punish someone for being trans, that's not based on their sex assigned at birth, that's based on their identity as a trans person, not necessarily their identity as a man or a woman, which would of course be, instead of, essentially, Title IX bans sex discrimination, and so if it's framed in such a way that, oh, a man can't, or a biological male can't do X, Y, Z, that would be not allowed. If it says people can't be trans, that is allowed, which is really dangerous for obvious reasons. So as I said earlier, it's also important to remember that this isn't only happening now, that trans people have been viewed this way for a long time. And for a long time, this level of transphobia was mainly upheld by the courts, not legislation. So we see sort of a wave of anti-trans policy really picking up in the 70s and 80s, which makes sense because that was soon after the beginning of sort of the first wave of trans people gaining more visibility with the gay liberation movement, the Stonewall riots, and etc. So in the 70s and 80s, when trans people first sort of slowly began coming out of the closet and becoming more visible within sort of mainstream cisgender heterosexual culture, trans people were regularly fired from their jobs, kicked out of their houses, that sort of thing, for cross-dressing. And many of them, or for some version of that, and many of them went to the courts to try to challenge it, and almost none of them were successful. So employers would usually argue that trans people were either bad for business, that customers would come in, see a trans person and walk out, or that they were directly dangerous to customers. And courts would generally agree. So a few examples of this were in 1975, Carolyn Lynn Boyles was fired from her job as a hemodialysis assistant at a medical center because her presence in the ward could potentially harm already sick patients, according to the courts. Then in 1978, a hairdresser named Reagan Kelly Kirkpatrick was fired for wearing women's clothing at work, despite a doctor's note attesting to the fact that she was in fact a woman. And a federal judge wrote that employees should, quote, dress and act as persons of their biological sex, because allowing employees to do otherwise may disturb the customers and cause them to take their business elsewhere. Then in 1980, Eastern Airlines fired Karen U. Lane, a transgender pilot who was working for them, because she threatened the safety of passengers, a decision that was also upheld by the courts. So as you can see, this was sort of a pattern, and up until this year, really, that was a pattern, or last year now, that was a pattern when a trans person, it was a very similar story, a trans person was fired for being trans, and they took it to court and they won, actually. So that was a monumental occasion because that sort of changed the Supreme Court precedent, or set the Supreme Court precedent, because before that, none of these cases even made it there. So that was a huge deal. But in addition to policy that sort of directly targets trans people, there's also lots of legislation that, while it doesn't directly target trans people, it does disproportionately harm them. So sex legislation, which would be the sort of best example of this, disproportionately harms trans people because sex work is often really the only option for trans people under capitalism, especially sort of looking at the history of employment discrimination, housing discrimination, all these other things which sort of force trans people into poverty. Then criminalizing their one form of income is often a death sentence. And in addition to that, a lot of sort of sex work, anti-sex work legislation has just been blatantly used for justifying acts of transphobia by law enforcement. One of the greatest examples of this was in New York, and I believe in several other states as well. There was a law that if police suspected someone of loitering for the purpose of prostitution, they could be arrested, despite not having any proof that they were there for the purpose of prostitution. So this was nicknamed the Walking While Trans ban because trans women, and of course mainly trans women of color and poor trans women, were constantly just arrested for no reason using this law. So that's sort of one example. In addition to that, gun control sort of disproportionately harms trans people in that it sort of restricts trans people's right to the essential right to self-defense, and restricts their avenues for protest against sort of state that has shown it does not care for our lives. It also, police wrongdoing disproportionately impacts trans people. According to the National Center for Trans Equality, roughly 50% of trans people reported feeling uncomfortable seeking police help. 22% of trans people who have interacted with the police reported harassment, and 6% of all trans people reported being the victims of bias-motivated assault by police. And these numbers are all roughly doubled for Black and Indigenous trans people. In addition to that, the prison industrial complex as a whole is particularly harmful to trans people, because trans people are often forced into prisons that don't correspond with their gender identity. They're denied gender affirming care in prisons that is often life-saving. And while they're incarcerated, they experience sexual assault at roughly 10 times the rate of incarcerated cis people, also according to the National Center for Trans Equality. Also in housing, there's often sort of a lack of accessibility to affordable housing for everyone. That's sort of a running issue that I'm sure we've all sort of heard about at this point. And that also sort of disproportionately harms trans people for some of the issues I was talking about earlier, that since they're so regularly, or we're so regularly restricted in terms of our avenues for income, we're forced into poverty. So this sort of lack of affordable housing often forces trans people out onto the streets, where they're particularly at risk for things like assault or other violent crimes. So all of this is sort of going to show that trans people sort of constantly face anti-trans legislation, whether it looks like what we're seeing now in legislation that's directly saying trans people can't do XYZ, or legislation that says people can't participate in sex work. Those are both forms of anti-trans legislation, and should be treated as such. So what does it mean to sort of treat these issues? So you can look at it as we need to deal with the sort of current wave of anti-trans legislation that, as I said, that is a sort of specific and unique issue that we're facing right now that we sort of need to deal with immediately. And the avenue for that is putting pressure on the courts and voting in local elections. So as I said, the reason that all of this is allowed, essentially, is that trans people don't have protections under the law. So another sort of avenue is email or writing or calling to your Congress people to petition them to pass the Equality Act. That would, of course, create a much more equitable society for the entire LGBTQ community. But in addition to that, on the local level, we obviously see that that's sort of the go-to route for this anti-trans legislation. That almost all of it has been passed through state and local legislatures. So it's important that we replace the people who are putting through this legislation. And it's also important to keep in mind that local elections often have a greater opportunity for electing people who genuinely stand up for the rights of marginalized people than, for example, the presidential elections or sort of larger federal elections. This is because there's often just lower turnout. So when sort of a very new or energizing candidate runs, a lot of times it's actually possible for them to win if they energize enough people that maybe wouldn't normally come out to vote for such a small election. That's sort of much more doable than if you're trying to energize people who don't normally vote in presidential elections. So what I don't mean by that is just vote blue no matter who, because as I said, this anti-trans legislation is constant. It doesn't matter whether we're being controlled by Democrats or Republicans. Both of them pass anti-trans legislation. This means that you should research the people running in your local elections, and chances are there will be people who defend trans people. In addition to that, putting pressure on the courts. A lot of this, as I said, can be challenged by the courts. There are arguments that transphobia in all its forms is blocked by Title IX or other parts of the law. So a lot of those fights are going to the courts. So supporting people like the ACLU, things like that are essential. And finally, mutual aid is essential for supporting trans people now and always. But essentially, mutual aid allows trans people and all communities, this doesn't just hold true for trans community, allows people to rely on their own community instead of relying on capitalism to provide their resources, which is just a much more stable and reliable sort of means of getting them, because as we know, capitalism is not set up in such a way to provide everyone with their adequate amount of resources. It's set up to provide whoever has the most funds with their resources. And so trans people, since they're so often kept in poverty, don't often have access to what they need through capitalism, whether that's just money for housing and food and things like that, or greater access to healthcare. All of these can be sort of solved through a mutual aid lens. For example, in New York, we have a medical center called the Callan Lord Health Center that is specifically for queer people and especially for trans people, that is pay what you want, has some of the best doctors available, And that's sort of a mutual aid setup of providing healthcare for trans people. So those sorts of things allow trans people to just get what they need, even if they don't have the money, which we so often do not. Then long-term, to sort of deal with the transphobia ingrained in our society and not just dealing with the abolition of capitalism, not just dealing with this legislation. The long term would mean the sort of moving past capitalism and working towards a socialist or communistic society. So as I've sort of covered already, anything that isn't economically productive is bad under capitalism. That it's not worthwhile, and we often don't have time for it. So transness, which is often not economically productive, it's not exactly a moneymaker. It's actually incredibly expensive to be trans. Much of this medical interventions that we're talking about are already only really accessible if you have the funds, which is sort of another issue. Another issue with this. Since it's not focused on productivity, it's essentially a distraction, and capitalism can't really make space for us. Also, since capitalism is sort of centered around a market economy, it can't, as I was saying, it can't be trusted to adequately provide for the needs of such a small minority because of supply and demand. So this causes trans people to not really have access to many of the resources that they may need. Capitalism also needs and perpetuates transphobia because it relies on the division of the working class so that we don't unite against the ruling class. That the more sort of divisions and the more that we hate each other, the less we're hating the people that are keeping us in this position. So socialism or communism would sort of allow trans people to pursue what would feel good instead of pursuing what is profitable. It would allow us to get the resources we need, and it would be actively harmed by transphobia instead of being helped by it. So that is sort of a synopsis of our next steps. And that's it.
Chris, you're still muted. Hold on. There you go.
Okay. Thank you very much, Cassidy. And we really appreciate that. I know that you may have to leave at some point because you are working as we speak. So
I actually think I have to leave right now. So
okay.
Sorry about that, but bye.
All right. Goodbye. And thank you for your contribution, your speech. It was great.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sarah Scott, and she's a Black lesbian feminist living in Seattle. She's a writer and a reproductive justice activist with Radical Women. And she's also a member of the Comrades of Color Caucus. So welcome, Sarah, and it's your turn.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Happy Pride. I'm so glad to be speaking on this panel. I'm a mixed race, Black and white lesbian. Throughout growing up, I never felt that I belonged. On the one hand, I was in the closet till I turned 18 and moved away to college. In terms of racism, I grew up around mostly white kids on the Seattle East Side. I did not experience many overt racial slurs, but I did find myself always trying to look more white. Although I am a cisgender female, my experiences with discrimination have given me an understanding of how it feels to be rejected by mainstream society because I do not fit into a narrow traditional standard of womanhood. The same system that rejected me because I could not conform to a racist, homophobic, and anti-feminist ideal of my gender is the same system that rejects trans people, especially trans women, because they do not fit into a narrow standard of what a man or a woman should be. Tonight, I'm going to explain how that same system is currently amping up its attacks against trans youth in two areas, as Cassidy said, sports and healthcare. I'm also going to explain why they are doing so and why the capitalist system has so much to gain by attacking trans youth. Capitalists seek to pit us against each other in order to keep all minorities down, which makes us all easier to exploit. Along with Black women, trans women are among the most oppressed workers, and young trans girls especially are being set up to continue as cheap labor by being denied other opportunities. And that's why I'm also going to explain why working class solidarity is the answer, with most oppressed workers at the forefront. First, what is happening to trans youth? The recent attacks against trans youth, led by Republicans and the right wing, might seem like they are just starting, but it is part of a larger anti-LGBTQ agenda that included the fight against same-sex marriage and the recent bathroom bills that tried to prevent people from using the bathroom that corresponds to their gender, and much more. A trans person's ability to play sports without hiding who they are or to safely receive gender-affirming healthcare was never an option at all until recently. And these attacks are a backlash against the progress that has recently been made. For centuries, the capitalist system has depended for its existence on maintaining a strict gender binary, because capitalism began as a means for women and children to be treated as property, using biologically determined gender roles. The existence of trans people, as well as LGBTQ people, calls the heteronormative structure of society into a question, and this is a good thing. There have been over 200 anti-trans bills in 33 states in 2021, which target either healthcare or sports. For now, most of these bills seem to be getting killed or vetoed, but the far right will keep trying to push them through, and new bills will be proposed in the future. 6 states have already signed anti-trans bills into law: Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Montana, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Most of them are bans against trans youth in sports, although Arkansas has enacted a bill regarding denial of healthcare. In the sports arena, arguments are being made especially against trans girls on the basis that including trans girls on high school sports teams will cause harm to cisgender girls. It is no coincidence that in a patriarchal society, it is trans girls who are being targeted the most. Capitalists fear solidarity between girls and women, and instead, they would rather have us infighting and playing high school popularity games. For example, there was the case of Chelsea Mitchell, a cisgender girl who claimed to be discriminated against because a Black trans girl beat her on the track. What the conservative ads that use her case as an argument don't mention is she beat a trans girl in another match. A recent study was done which found that after a year of hormone replacement therapy, the average trans woman could be said to have no physical advantage over a cisgender woman. And similarly, a trans boy who has had hormone therapy would have even more of an advantage than a trans woman if forced to play on a girls' sports team. This shows that these arguments aren't really about facts at all, but just another way to target and discriminate against trans youth, girls and women especially. Who's behind these attacks and what do they have to gain? As I mentioned before, Republicans and far-right groups are leading these efforts. Even some radical feminists and environmentalist organizations like Deep Green Resistance have aligned with far-right groups to attack the rights of trans people. In 2019, there was a panel of 4 anti-trans feminists that was hosted by the conservative Heritage Foundation. On the panel were 3 women from WOLF, the Women's Liberation Front, and a professor who identified as ex-trans who argued against the Equality Act and against including gender identity as a protected status. Wolf had previously aligned with Focus on the Family in order to fight against a trans man who wanted to use the men's bathroom. Now, Wolf is even helping shape legislation in places like South Dakota, which last month became the first state to advance a wave of state bills nationwide banning medical interventions for transgender youth. Radical Women was very proud to stand with other trans activists and community members against this transphobic group Wolf last February when they came to Seattle. That's an example of what we need to keep doing. We need to keep making those alliances. These anti-trans radical feminists, or TERFs, operate on the ironically chauvinist belief that femininity is based on biology, that women are biologically inferior to men and must therefore be protected on the basis of biology, and that men are the enemy. Where this argument falls apart is the numerous statistics that show how gendered oppression is a social phenomena, with Black trans women being the most oppressed and the most likely to be murdered or commit suicide. The bills banning access to healthcare and sports only fuel greater violence against trans people. Every year, dozens of trans women are killed, and more transgender people were killed in the US in the first 6 months of 2021 than in all of 2019. It's no surprise that the spike in violence has coincided with legislative attempts to dehumanize the community. As a socialist feminist, I am disgusted by the alliance of the right wing and radical feminists, and the fact that they have the nerve to pose as advocates for women's rights. We cannot allow this transphobia to be used in our name. These bigots attacking trans youth are the same bigots who are against gay marriage, who want to ban affirmative action and to ban abortion and other reproductive rights as a means to control our bodies and lives. These are the people who oppose universal health care and who also see denying trans youth gender-affirming care as another way to diminish government spending on healthcare. And banning trans youth from sports is just another attack on public education. They want everyone but the top 1% to be under their control, so they will work for less than they deserve and then spend all their money on rent, so they're too busy and tired to organize. If we come together and fight this, there is no stopping us. What can we do about it? Come together and build the fight back. The good news is that there is a strong opposition to these transphobic attacks. A recent poll by PBS shows that over 2/3 of people in the US don't support these bills. Additionally, trans youth are protesting, testifying at state hearings, and contacting lawmakers. Over 17,000 teachers and educational workers signed an open letter to the Biden administration demanding that more is done for trans youth, and over 1,500 parents signed a similar letter. 550 college athletes demanded the NCAA cancel events in states that approve anti-trans legislation. The NCAA said they will not have championship games in states. Well-known athletes such as a retired Black football player, R.K. Russell, and women's soccer champion, Megan Rapinoe, have written strong op-eds in defense of trans youth. Right on. Radical Women also believes that we must fight for the rights of trans non-binary people. The whole idea of gender segregation in sports is problematic because it still totally excludes non-binary people. Sports teams should be organized not around gender, but around a diversity of characteristics. And as a sailor, I know this is possible. All boats compete in the same race, being ranked by a diversity of characteristics. Each boat is given a unique handicap rating from less than 0 for the fastest boats to 300 for the slowest. However, a society without gender segregation is not going to happen overnight. We see the ultimate goal as a socialist revolution, after which transphobia, misogyny, and systemic oppression will no longer exist. And we can get there with intersectional, working class revolutionary feminism. However, now we must still fight for trans liberation, reproductive justice, and affirmative action under capitalism. So long as there are boys and girls teams, we must fight for inclusion of trans boys and girls, while also fighting for teams that are not based on gender at all. And that fight needs to happen right here in Washington State. I must admit that I believed I wasn't seeing Washington on the list of states that had any anti-trans bills being considered, because I believed the state is more progressive in a lot of ways. However, there was an anti-trans bill in Washington State that was quietly introduced in March. The bill seeks to grant the board of directors in each school district the power to unilaterally decide whether transgender students will be required to compete on the sports team that matches the sex they were assigned at birth. If the bill passes, every student will be required to provide a birth certificate before they compete. We need to fight this bill when the 2022 state legislative session begins. No matter where you are, the far right and even some on the left are unifying to attack the rights of trans people. Therefore, this fight needs to happen right here as much as in the South, and it needs to include working class people of all identities. The right wing's attacks are multi-issue, which means that we all have a common enemy. Therefore, we need to form a united front to take them on, which must include real demands for more than just crumbs and defending the right to exist. Radical Women has been organizing in defense of trans rights for many years. Our comrade Emma Allen published a leaflet called Unpacking Transphobia, which can be found on our website. Since the 1960s, we have advocated for a united front that is socialist and multi-issue in its demands to eradicate transphobia, homophobia, racism, and all other forms of bigotry and oppression. The system makes a lot of money off of our oppression, which is why the working class has so much to gain by uniting. We are a revolutionary socialist feminist organization made up of working class women and non-binary people who believe our leadership is vital to the movement. If this sounds like you, I hope you will read our manifesto and approach us about joining. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Sarah, so much. And I just want to show people a copy of the Radical Women Manifesto, which you can certainly get online at radicalwomen.org and also at the bookstore here in Seattle if you're local. Okay, and our next speaker is JESS STEEVER. They go by they, them, their. Jess is a queer labor organizer who is they're Freedom Socialist Party's representative to the End Homelessness Now campaign in Los Angeles. So welcome, Jess.
Thanks, Chris. Hey guys, hey everybody. My name is Jess. I'm a member of the Freedom Socialist Party in LA, and I am a revolutionary socialist feminist. And yep, my pronouns are they, them, their. Happy Pride, and thank you for having me here today. It's a privilege to be here with this community celebrating Pride the only way that we know how, which is to continue fighting back against injustice and violence against our trans and queer siblings and comrades. By being here today, we all honor the revolutionary spirit of our LGBTQ ancestors who put their hearts and bodies on the line for this fight and never settled for compromise or the status quo when it came to queer liberation. We're here today because despite how far we've come and the gains that we've made politically and culturally, LGBTQ people are still facing violence. We are still specifically experiencing an all-out attack, legislative attack against trans people in this country, most specifically against trans kids. This attack on trans youth breaks my heart. It breaks my heart because I remember being a queer kid. I remember feeling overwhelming discomfort in the locker room as I battled with my own dysmorphia playing high school sports. I remember feeling like there was no place for me on any team because of my gender identity that I was still struggling to understand. I also remember that the queer spaces that did exist in the public high school, and state-funded colleges that I attended were critical in my journey of understanding and accepting my identities and of learning how to be an empowered participant in my community. We should be investing in inclusivity in our schools, in creating safe spaces and equipping educators with the skills to welcome and support all students. It breaks my heart that despite all we've learned since I was in school, our governments are writing licenses for our school systems to discriminate. This attack makes me angry, and I'm angry because I've been fighting for queer and trans rights for a decade. I know I'm still very young, but that's a long time in my life. And here we are, we're taking another step backwards. I was first politicized by the effort to save marriage equality in my home state of New Hampshire from repeal in 2010 and 2011. And following that, in 2012 and 2013, I engaged New Hampshire voters about the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, a piece of federal anti-discrimination legislation that has been introduced in every Congress since 1994 except one, and has failed to pass every year when Congress was even when Congress was in Democrat control. And now that the broader Equality Act has the vocal support of the Biden-Harris cabinet, we shall see if the Democrats have the power or the political will to get it passed. Despite my efforts, this ugliness is rearing its head again in my hometown. In New Hampshire, there are two anti-trans bills going through our legislature, one that would exclude trans girls from participating in girls' sports, and another that would criminalize parents for allowing their children to receive gender-confirming healthcare like puberty blockers. As a non-binary kid who grew up in New Hampshire and worked hard to make it more inclusive, I take this personally. I am angry at this broken political system that makes it impossible to truly allow for trans liberation. And finally, this attack leaves me baffled because it's mostly founded on the bizarre supposition that real women need to be protected from false women. Some self-identified feminists would have you believe women who were not born with certain bodies should not be believed when they tell you that they are women. They perpetuate the backwards notion of biological determinism. They deny that the attack on trans identities is capitalism's retaliation against the dismantling of the patriarchal division of labor, and that by defending transphobia, they are actually upholding the patriarchy. Well, my feminism nurtures diversity and affirms identity. It doesn't perpetuate gender-based discrimination by narrowly defining womanhood and ostracizing those who don't fit in. How actually unfeminist is that? Trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary people are who they say they are, and feminism is about embracing that and defending that, not perpetuating fear. Sadly, this current batch of legislative attacks is just a small part of how trans youth are ostracized under capitalism. This is because capitalism thrives on division of all forms: transphobia, homophobia, xenophobia, racism, sexism, ableism, the list goes on. You can see the capitalist trickery exemplified in pay gaps, for example. When the boss pays the white worker more, the boss is telling that worker that they are better than the Black worker, and then the white worker forgets and that they deserve the pay raise because that they are white and intrinsically more valuable. Meanwhile, the white worker forgets that they are still a worker entitled only to the boss's scraps, despite being the one who actually produces the boss's profits. Replace the words Black and white with trans and cisgender, gay and straight, immigrant and natural born citizen, and you can start to get the idea. When working people are divided, we lack the power to unite as a class and fight for the things we all inherently have a right to: safety, autonomy, abundance. By dividing us in these ways, capitalists have for generations been able to hoard the material wealth that, if properly distributed, could guarantee everyone's rights to these things. And right now, trans youth are specifically being harmed by capitalism. I see this today where I live in Los Angeles, where the excuseless housing crisis is only getting worse, with over 80,000 people experiencing homelessness in the county. With other members of the Freedom Socialist Party, I work on the End Homelessness Now LA campaign. Trans youth are particularly at risk of experiencing homelessness. According to the Los Angeles LGBTQ Center, 40% of homeless youth in Southern California identify as LGBTQ. And in 2020, the Los Angeles Homelessness Service Authority reported that over 9,000 youth under the age of 24 had experienced homelessness in LA that year, with only about 5,000 of those being housed within the year. Queer youth are already at more than double the risk of homelessness, as many experience ostracism from their families. And today, more families are becoming homeless because of a hostile economy that rewards corporations over workers, directly affecting the children of all genders in those families. That same broken economy discourages queer folk from secure employment, and that exclusion is most harshly felt by trans women of color. As a result, 34% of Black trans women today face housing insecurity. The very obvious solution to ending homelessness, short of immediately overhauling the whole capitalist system, is the creation of housing that all people can afford. And that is the solution that End Homelessness Now LA is fighting for, the establishment of permanent supportive public housing using vacant properties that our city and county already owns. It's such a common sense solution that could alleviate housing insecurity for thousands of Angelenos, especially populations like the trans community who are disproportionately affected. The problem is that solution doesn't benefit the profit-driven private developers who have their hands in our legislators' pockets. In this city run by Democrats, the ones who are supposed to give a damn about us, or so they say, the capitalists would rather wave a rainbow flag, slap on a blue and pink pin for a month, than use their power to really help trans people. So what are we supposed to do? When our economy excludes us, when our legislature tries to erase us, when our self-proclaimed allies and defenders abandoned their promises, we need to build a united front with trans and working class leadership to protect trans and queer people. Sarah and Chris have already talked a little bit about what a united front is, that it's a group of people and organizations that join together to achieve a shared goal. So I think I want to talk a little bit about the importance of working class leadership and what that means. I was a union rep and organizer with UFCW for several years, and I have a lot of feelings about queer labor activism, but I'll try to keep it short. Anyway, when I first ventured into queer activism, it was through the vehicle of the Democratic Party, which is just one half of the ruling capitalist class. I was promised that if we passed enough laws, queer people would be treated better. And while we won some gains that I am still very proud of, what I'm witnessing now is that trans people still experience violence every day from the same systems that promised us relief. So if the people in power are either actively attacking us or betraying their promises to protect us, it's up to the working class to defend ourselves and to make our own demands. Organized labor is an important component in the United Front. Workers have a tremendous amount of power because of their ability to withhold their labor. An example of how labor can make big wins for the broader community is the 2019 UTLA teachers strike, which I got to help out a little bit at. And it was honestly one of the proudest moments of my life. They didn't just demand higher wages, but prioritized demands that benefited the students, like smaller class sizes, more counselors and school psychologists, and more supportive resources for the students. Like Sarah mentioned, in response to the legislative attacks sweeping the nation, over 17,000 teachers and educational workers sent an open letter to the Biden administration demanding that the government do more to protect trans youths. And hey, the Biden administration may or may not take meaningful action, but could you imagine if 17,000 teachers went on strike to demand that their school systems include protections and resources for trans students? Where our lawmakers fail, workers have the power to make meaningful differences without compromising our trans comrades. As a revolutionary socialist, I believe that trans liberation can only truly be realized under socialism, and that the United Front is just one important step towards dismantling capitalism. The Democrats would have us believe that we can reform our way to prosperity and freedom. But the fact of the matter is that this kind of violence has been happening under the rule of Democrats. We had 8 years of Obama, y'all, and here we are still. Big business would have us believe that if we just support corporations who wish us a happy pride and make statements opposing these legislative attacks, such as Facebook and Amazon did, that we can buy our way into a kinder, more equal capitalism. But the reality is corporations like Facebook and Amazon have either ignored warnings of hate group activity on their networks or treat their employees with criminally grueling and unsafe conditions. So the hypocrisy is overwhelming. The only economic system that will truly work for trans people and the working class at large is one where workers are in charge. Politicians and corporate bosses don't care about trans kids. We do. And that's why I'm in the fight for the socialist feminist revolution. And if you would like to be in the fight too, then you should check out socialism.com and get in touch with your nearest Freedom Socialist Party branch. Thank you for having me. Happy Pride.
Chris, you're muted still.
There's that unmuted, it looks like. All right, sorry. Thank you, Jess. Here is the Freedom Socialist Party pamphlet, Socialist Feminism and the Revolutionary Party. And like the Radical Women Manifesto, it helps explain theory and action of our organization. So I think just to refresh everyone where we are, we're going to start discussion in a few minutes, but before that, next up is Sue Dosical. And just for your knowledge, she's one of the founders of the Stonewall Committee and the Freedom Day Committee, and Sue and I have worked closely together in those groups. But she'll let you know how you can help.
Okay, thanks. Happy Pride, everybody. And you know, the stands that activists and community organizations take and the composition of those groups really reflects their funding base. Radical Women and the Freedom Socialist Party have both stayed true to their revolutionary feminist program because people like you have sustained us financially with your donations and volunteer time. So I'm proud to ask you for a donation this afternoon to help us expand our educational and organizing efforts. Please donate what you can. It'll be up in the link there. It's in chat. Okay. You can use a debit card, you can use a credit card at the link, or you can go old school and mail a check in made out to Radical Women. The money raised today will be equally divided between our two organizations. And so please look in the chat for the donation link and the address. I really encourage people to also put the amount you want to donate into the chat. And at the end of the discussion, we can announce the total raised. Money does talk. When I helped organize some of those early Pride marches along with Chris in Seattle, we used to raise money by going around to all the queer bars on Saturday nights and asking the customers to buy a button for $1 or just throw some cash in our donation jars. At the end of the night, we'd sit down and count the money together, document it, and turn it into the treasurer. The treasurer, in turn, issued public finance reports that were printed in Seattle Gay News. And it's not just an interesting story, but it explains why those marches had bold political messages, not only around queer and trans rights, but also things like abortion rights, affirmative action, and a lot more. Even pro-labor stands too. Over time, Pride organizers turned to Budweiser and then Alaska Airlines ad nauseum to fund their events. And this not only made the parades much more boring, but they sold their soul. Instead of the outrageous participatory marches and rallies, most cities now have parades that are an endless stream of corporate logos that have replaced political slogans, with the community reduced to cheering from the sidelines. So yes, money does talk. So let's get chatty. Please donate whatever you are able to by debit or credit card via the Radical Women link that's in chat, or mail in a check. Your donations today will make it possible for us to start reopening New Freeway Hall down in Columbia City, now that we're emerging from the pandemic, and we could do more in-person agitating and organizing against the right. And Radical Women's launching a campaign to help stop the erosion of abortion rights this fall by the Supreme Court, along with a lot of other projects. With donations from working class people like you, we are free to speak truth to power. I'll turn it back to the chair now so we can get the discussion started, but please take a moment before we're finished today to make that donation and put it in chat so we can announce the total. I thank you, and I am confident that you're going to feel extra good about putting your money where your heart is on this 52nd anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And to kick it off, my partner and I are going to donate $52 in honor of the Stonewall anniversary. Others might be inspired to do the same, but anything helps. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Sue.